Hi, I'm Michael Odie. I'm a SolarWinds contributor and president and CTO of Tekka Inc. And today we're going to talk about what you need to know about SQL Server 2014 licensing. You know, it seems that licensing sometimes is as complicated as using the technology is, and there are a lot of twists, turns, and gotchas with SQL Server 2014 licensing. In this presentation, we're going to cover some of the things that you really need to know. We're going to talk about the difference between server and CAL licensing versus core licensing, and what you need to know about buying core licensing if you're going to. We're going to talk about licensing SQL Server components, say reporting services, analysis services. What happens if you install those on separate servers? Then we're going to talk about virtualization and licensing. Virtualization always throws in a few twists and turns, and we'll see what those are with SQL Server 2014. And then we'll talk a little bit about failover scenarios with like AlwaysOn Availability Groups and AlwaysOn failover clustering instances. How do passive SQL Server instances or readable replicas affect what you need to do when you have licensing issues? First, it's important to know that with SQL Server 2014, it has two different licensing scenarios. There's server and CAL licensing, and then there's core licensing. Core licensing actually started with SQL Server 2012, and it continues over to SQL Server 2014. So let's take a quick look at the difference. With a server and CAL license, this is the more traditional way to license SQL Server. And here, every server instance you have, you need a license for that server. And then you need a CAL, which is a client access license for each device or each user that accesses that SQL Server system. This is best for on-premise implementations where you know the number of users and devices that are going to connect to the system, and you can buy the appropriate number of CALs to connect them to. Core licensing, though, it's quite different. Core licensing, there are no CALs required, and you're not licensing per server per se. You're instead licensing per total number of cores. There is a minimum of four core licenses that are required, and there are a few things you need to know. For instance, if you're using core licensing on a physical server, then you need to license all of the CPUs in that server. If you are using core licensing with virtual server instances, then essentially each virtual CPU needs a core license. There are a few things to know about virtualization that I'll cover a little bit later. This kind of implementation, though, core licensing, since you don't need any CALs, you don't necessarily need to know how many users and devices are connected, so it's best for internet and cloud type of implementations. So the different SQL Server 2014 editions each have different licensing kind of requirements. SQL Server Standard Edition, it supports both server and CAL or core licensing, so you can choose whichever is most cost effective for your own implementation. The SQL Server Business Edition, it only supports server plus CAL licensing, and the SQL Server Enterprise Edition, it supports core licensing only. One of the things that people sometimes wonder about when they ask me questions is, what if I split out my different SQL Server components? For instance, on large implementations, they often have the database engine on one server, the reporting services component on another server, and analysis services on another system. But it's important to know that you can't license these components separately. If you do this, each installation requires a full license for SQL Server. So splitting them out like that is not a cost-saving implementation, but you do it for performance and other reasons. But each implementation, for instance, the database engine and the reporting engine, if you split them out, they would each require a separate SQL Server license. So that's important to know when you're installing your components on different servers. What about virtualization and licensing? With virtualization and licensing, you can basically choose between licensing individual VMs versus a maximum licensing kind of scenario. If you're licensing individual VMs, you can choose either the server and CAL or the per core kind of licensing scenario, depending on what edition of SQL Server you're using. Off to the right here, you can see a couple of examples on the top. This is an example of using core licensing with VMs. In our VM number 1, you're licensing 2 virtual cores. But in order to do that, you have to have 4 core licenses. Now, why is that? Because there's a minimum of 4 core licenses required for every instance. So 4 core licenses is the minimum. VM2, it's using 4 virtual CPUs, and so there, 4 core licenses are required. And VM number 3, it has using 6 virtual CPUs, and so there 6 virtual core licenses are required. The maximum licensing scenario, it's something you can use if you have the Enterprise Edition and you license all of the cores in the host. If you license all of the cores in the host, essentially you can have 1 VM for each host core license. So say in this scenario, you might have a server and it has 16 core licenses that you've purchased with the Enterprise Edition. In that case, you could have 16 VMs that run on that server, and those 16 VMs, each one of them can have any number of virtual CPUs in them. There's no limit to that, but you could have 16 CPU or 16 virtual machines running out there to match those 16 core licenses. Now, what if you needed more? Well, in that case, you'd have to buy additional core licenses for the additional VMs that you'd want to run. Another thing that comes up is, what if I have passive SQL Server instances, or what if I'm using AlwaysOn Availability Groups and I have read-only replicas? Well, a passive SQL Server instance by definition is a SQL Server instance that doesn't run a workload. So in that case, it is actually sitting there waiting for a failover event to happen. In that case, that server does not require a SQL Server license. With SQL Server 2012, this ability to have passive licenses was covered under the basic SQL Server license itself. But there were some limitations. For instance, if you had a failover, if you didn't have SA, you couldn't really fail back until the 90-day period was over. There's a 90-day mobility limitation to moving licenses. SQL Server 2014 changed this, and with SQL Server 2014, passive instances are no longer covered under the SQL Server license. Instead, they're covered under SA. So you need to have software assurance on those passive servers. But if you do, there is no limitation on how frequently you might reassign the licenses in a failover, failback kind of situation. So, and again, the key point to remember about a passive SQL Server instance, though, that server is not running a workload. It's not running backups. It's not running queries. Readable secondaries are a different sort of scenario. Readable secondaries are something you can set up with AlwaysOn Availability Groups, and this gives you a way to have scale-out processing where you can move your query workload or your backup workload from your primary OLTP server to one of those secondary replicas. In this case, though, it's important to recognize those are SQL Server workloads. So in that case, you would have to have a license for that SQL Server, whether it be core licensing or server licensing. Those secondary SQL Server replicas would need to be licensed in order to use readable secondaries. That's the end of this presentation. Thank you for attending.